Hello and welcome to Better Without Billboards. I'm Nicola and next to me is James.
Hello.
Now it's the last episode of Series 2 and I'm really looking forward to this conversation because today we're going to take a look back at some of the highlights over the last 12 months and also what's happened since in all these different areas we've been talking about around outdoor advertising. So let's jump right in and start with a big topic and a really exciting update. Now, in the first ever episode of the podcast, we kicked off with a look at some new research back then from Adfree Cities, in which we found that outdoor advertising is more concentrated in areas of greater deprivation, lower income, and worse air pollution. And we talked about how removing outdoor advertising could help to address inequality, as well as reducing the influence of consumerism in our lives, and improving our happiness, health, public space, and just generally being really good for nature and the climate as well. I mean, what's not to like, right? We also discussed the planning system in that one and the need to reform the planning regulations to ensure that councils can refuse outdoor advertising and address all these issues.
So what's the update then, Nicola?
Yes, so the update is this. So there's currently a huge piece of legislation going through Parliament called the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. And this bill covers everything from building homes to restoring nature. It's basically a wholesale reform of the planning system in England and Wales. And this bill is our opportunity also to bring much needed changes to planning rules for outdoor advertising. Now we're really proud to have worked with Green MP Carla Denyer to propose an amendment to this planning and infrastructure bill. The amendment would give councils more powers to refuse planning permission for more ads on the grounds of environmental and public health aspects.
Okay, environment and public health. So how is that different from the current rules?
Well, the big issue is this, that current planning rules only allow councils to consider applications for new adverts on two grounds. And that's road safety, so that's how the ad will distract drivers, and also amenity, this kind of poorly defined way of saying how attractive an area is. And these rules haven't been updated since the 60s and are partly to blame for the explosion of outdoor advertising in recent years, especially new digital billboards and freestanding advertising screens. So our amendment would broaden the criteria that councils and therefore residents have to block new ads to include public health and environmental concerns.
Well, that sounds fantastic. Brilliant. A really sort of milestone in our national policy adventure.
Yes.
Well, what a great start to the episode and to our updates. What's next, Nicola?
Well, our next episode featured the artist Darren Cullen talking about his work campaigning against oil giant Shell. And I think you've got an update for this one, James.
Yes, I have. So in that episode, I talked with Darren about Shell, oil giant Shell and their adverts, and how Shell uses greenwash in its advertising to mislead and cover up all the awful things that they're doing to people and the planet through their extraction of oil and gas. Now, at the time of that episode, we had submitted a complaint to the ad regulator, the ASA, mentioned ad nauseum on this podcast, the ASA, a complaint regarding an advert for Shell that aired last year. And this advert was just like a classic example of greenwash, right? So it showcased Shell's investments in electric car charging points, had some nice images of wind turbines, and basically made Shell out to be the good guys of the clean energy transition. And what's interesting is that at the same time, we also complained about an advert for Total, so the French energy company Total. And that advert was very similar. It focused on Total's investments in clean energy startups, including a wind energy company.
Right, so it would make sense if the ASA had banned both those ads, right?
It would make sense if they'd banned both of those ads. However, that's not what happened. So in the Total complaint, the ASA agreed with us that the ads were greenwash and banned them. But in the Shell complaint, the ASA disagreed with us and said that the ads were not greenwash.
Right, so why the difference?
So the difference was that the Shell ad ended with this kind of static frame in the advert with some like small print text reading, some details about Shell's investments in oil and gas versus their investments in renewables, and clarifying that they are still have a majority investment in fossil fuels. So basically that little bit of small text, as far as the ASA is concerned, is all that stands between a misleading advert and a not misleading advert.
Well, that sounds really unhelpful and quite frustrating. And where does that leave us in terms of fighting greenwash fossil fuel ads?
Yeah, exactly. It was a pretty disappointing ruling from the ASA as far as we were concerned. And I think it basically shows that the ASA's model of how it regulates adverts on a case-by-case basis is just not up to the task of cutting through the ocean of greenwash that's pumped out by polluting industries every single day.
Right. And that brings us to another update. Also a really exciting update. So there was a petition to the UK government, which was started by TV naturalist and personal hero of mine, Chris Packham, calling for a tobacco-style ban on fossil fuel advertising and sponsorship. And amazingly, this petition gained over 100,000 signatures, which is fantastic news. And it means that it will be debated in Parliament. In fact, it's going to be debated not long after this episode airs. So we'll wait with bated breath for the outcome of that.
Yeah, no, that was huge. Really, really huge moment for this, effort that the Adfree Cities and bad advertising as well have been kind of working towards for a number of years, this kind of tobacco-style ban. So, I mean, hats off to Chris Packham for bringing that to more, I guess, national policy attention. And to you, dear listener, tune into Series 3 of the Better Without Billboards podcast for updates on that in the future. But moving swiftly on then, so it's episode 3 of Series 1. We had this really interesting conversation with Professor Lizzie Nixon about how phone boxes seem to be appearing in many of our cities and towns, which serve no purpose other than to display as much advertising as possible. And often, as is in the case we discussed with Lizzie, the phones themselves don't even work. Now, this was a really, really interesting episode. And Nicola, do you want to give us a bit of an update on where we are with that?
Yeah, it was really interesting, wasn't it? And look, I think this is a really good chance to look at the work of our fantastic, wonderful volunteer adblock groups around the country. These groups around the UK are working hard to prevent the spread of advertising in our public spaces. And I want to share some of the amazing successes they've had. In the Adblock network, there are groups including in Leeds, Reading, Bristol, Norwich, Lambeth, Hackney, Cardiff, and more. These groups are all led by volunteers. They help people to know when there are new planning applications for digital ad screens through engaging with the planning system with local communities and councillors. And they're really helping to stop incidents like we talked about with Lizzie, where adverts just appear with apparently no warning. Mm-hmm. So Adblock Bristol, the group in Bristol, have recently managed to block 24 digital advertising units. Mm-hmm. It's fantastic. That is a lot of corporate ads thwarted that are not going to appear on our streets. Mm-hmm. And that success is on top of the incredible work that group's done over the past few years. They've managed to block over 40 huge digital billboards, as well as many, many, many more smaller units.
So just quickly on that, Nicola, what are they actually doing? What are those volunteers doing to stop those ads going up?
So what the Bristol group does, and other groups around the country are doing, they are identifying when new planning applications are coming up, mm-hmm. and they are helping residents who live near those potential sites and councillors who might be concerned to raise their concerns through the planning system. Mm-hmm. It's quite a complicated, difficult to access system, and unless you go looking for these planning applications, you don't know that they're happening. So those groups are really doing this tireless work week in, week out to make sure that people are aware of these potential billboard sites that are going to affect them and helping them to have their say.
Yeah, I think that's really important to say, because it can feel a bit daunting or boring even to object to a planning application. But that example there from Bristol clearly shows that it does actually make a difference. Are there more success stories we could talk about?
There are, and yes, I would just say it does make a huge difference. I always say this, do not underestimate how good it feels to block a billboard and for there to be billboard-free space because of your objections and because of your engagement on these issues. Huge. So yes, there are other successes we can point to. Let's talk about Adblock Norwich. Adblock Norwich had a huge win earlier this year. They mobilised resistance to propose a proposal for a huge 40-foot advertising screen in their shopping centre. It was rejected by the council. Fantastic work. Well done, Adblock Norwich, and everyone involved for that. residents and councillors didn't want this screen. It would have totally changed the area, would have made it more like Piccadilly Circus or Times Square. So groups like Adblock Norwich and Bristol and groups around the country, Leeds, Reading and beyond, they're helping people understand the potential harms of introducing corporate advertising infrastructure into public space, and they are having success. So I'd say, what does this show? I mean, it shows that while on the one hand, we are seeing a lack of action from the advertising regulator, as we've discussed, and we're seeing, slow progress, albeit progress, on reforming planning regulations. We're seeing really great action from local groups and councils to resist outdoor advertising, which is it's really positive. This moves us on to talking about local action against specific types of harmful advertising, because as well as seeing progress on resisting infrastructure for adverts, like we've just discussed, we've also seen action against the most harmful kinds of advertising too. Listeners might remember we spoke to Edinburgh councillor Ben Parker about their groundbreaking policy to limit high carbon advertising. And by that we mean advertising for fossil fuels, SUVs, airlines, cruise holidays. Now, we know that UK council policies like this are great, but they only cover advertising on council-owned sites, right? Mm-hmm. And I think you've got an update from over in the Netherlands, where councils have been going further.
Yes, the Netherlands really are just blazing a trail in this regard. And it all started with The Hague, the city of The Hague. In September last year, September 2024, The Hague city government passed a local law prohibiting advertising for fossil fuels and fossil fuel products, including cars and cruises and flights as well. And this was huge, right? This is absolutely world-leading stuff. One of the crucial differences here is that whereas in the UK we've seen some councils introduce policies against this kind of high carbon advertising, those policies are very limited, so they only affect like council owned advertising sites, like on bus shelters for instance. Whereas this local law in The Hague, it has an effect on privately owned advertising sites as well. So it's not just like bus shelters, it's all the billboards, it's all the freestanding ad screens in the city, it's everything. So it's really, really impactful. It's absolutely kind of first of its kind. So that was in September last year, and we were all very happy about that. I suppose unsurprisingly, this law didn't go down super well with some of the polluting industries affected, and in particular, actually, the travel industry. Kind of interestingly, the travel industry challenged The Hague in court. They took this new law to court, basically saying that it was unfair, that the Hague government was overstepping its powers, and so on. So there was this court case that went on at the end of last year and into this year, and I guess the really great news is that in April this year, the court made a ruling in favour of The Hague, in favour of that local law prohibiting fossil fuel advertising in the city.
Wow, that is really amazing news, and so good that was the court outcome. What does that mean then for other areas that might be wanting to do the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, it's somewhat limited. Like, talking in a UK context, this is, Dutch law doesn't necessarily translate into English law, obviously, very different legal systems. But some of the principles, I think, do translate. And so, reading through the ruling from the court in The Hague is quite interesting. The reasons that the court gave for backing the local law. So, for instance, one thing that the travel industry challenged in court was that there's no clear definition of what a fossil fuel advertisement is. How do you define a fossil fuel product, right? But the court came back and said, actually, that doesn't matter so much. You don't have to have a perfect definition of what constitutes a fossil fuel advertisement in order to implement this kind of ban. And a final one that I just want to touch on, which I think is really important in that court ruling, is that essentially public health trumps private profit, right? So in their ruling, one of the judges wrote so that the municipality, i.e. The Hague, is under no obligation to refrain from measures that promote public health in order to support the future financial position of the travel operators who are challenging the law, right? So essentially saying that these companies who are complaining that they're going to lose money by not being able to advertise, that comes second to public health. which I think is really, really, really important, and really, really encouraging to see that being written now into law, even though, as I say, this is in the Netherlands rather than the UK. But I think the principle is transferable, and that's what's really exciting.
That is really exciting. And has it had an effect on other Dutch cities, do we know of as yet?
It has. So there was an immediate kind of domino effect within weeks of that court case and the positive ruling. So I think there's now 4 of the Dutch cities have passed essentially identical laws, which is just brilliant. And it shows, once one city, in this case, just takes that bold step of doing this, other cities will follow. So the question now is what action are we going to see in the UK? We've already seen cities like Sheffield and Edinburgh introduce really bold policies against fossil fuel advertising. So who's going to take action next? And we've got our eyes on Transport for London, which is the biggest advertising estate in the whole world, and currently doesn't limit or restrict fossil fuel advertising, but there's a real case to be made that they ought to. So eyes on London to see what happens next, I think. So moving on to Series 2, we open with a really great episode, Nicola, where you looked into the kind of murky world of meat and dairy advertising. And for this episode, you spoke to Caitlin Smith at Changing Markets Foundation about some of the tactics of the meat and dairy industry that used in their advertising to distract, delay and derail policies that would address some of the health and environmental impacts of that industry.
Yes, I really enjoyed that chat with Caitlin, and I should start by saying that Changing Markets have continued to do more great work in this area, looking at this very under-recognised but really huge problem of methane emissions and the role of the meat and dairy industry. So they have several recent reports which expose a really worrying lack of action from supermarkets as well as big dairy and coffee house companies. And a recent report they did zeroed in specifically on dairy giant Arla. And they found that while Arla is celebrating their own sustainability efforts, they do put a lot more effort into greenwashing, creative calculations of emissions, and lobbying politicians to prevent actual progress than they do on genuinely making progress themselves. It's well worth looking up those great reports from Changing Markets.
I think perhaps the biggest story, the one that's perhaps had the most national presence here, is the national ban, the government's ban on junk food advertising, which would include a ban on online advertising for all sorts of unhealthy foods and a TV watershed of 9 p.m. to stop junk food advertising to children. So this has been kind of ongoing for a very long time, the idea of this kind of ban. And it was originally going to come into force October 2025 and has unfortunately been pushed back to early 2026 after industry pressure. So Nicola, what do you make of this?
Yeah, of course, this ban does sound like really good news, although, like you say, it has been a really long time coming. There's a really good short podcast from Fran Bernhardt of Sustain, who talks you through the catalogue of issues that has beset this legislation, which, like we say, is intended to protect children from serious health problems caused by this relentless pressure of aggressive, unhealthy food advertising. We'll add that podcast to the show notes because it's a really good summary of the sort of delays involved in this. If the policy does come into force in January, fingers crossed, finally, it will be a really important step forward. However, the policy does have this major blind spot in that it doesn't cover outdoor advertising, which obviously children see every day.
That does feel like a bit of a blind spot. Doesn't even quite cover it, right? And we've seen this in other areas, like vaping, for instance. Like vape ads are banned almost everywhere, but outdoor advertising gets through. So nicotine-containing vapes, that is. And we've even seen cases of nicotine-containing vapes being advertised within a couple of 100 meters of schools. And I guess the same is true with junk food as well, which actually was the subject of some really great work recently from Bite Back, right? The youth-led organisation which is fighting the influence of the junk food industry on young people. And they had this research specifically on junk food advertising on outdoor advertising like billboards, also looking at how that's targeted towards young people, how it's focused near schools and places where young people are likely to be.
Yeah, I mean, so Biteback's research really shows how important it is that we look at outdoor advertising for sure. So they looked at outdoor advertising in 4 different city locations in the UK, and they found that, as we know, but just really kind of finding that unhealthy food advertising outdoors is just totally inescapable, particularly for young people. They found, unsurprisingly, that advertising is dominated by McDonald's, this junk food giant. They dominate advertising space. They represent 31% of the food and drink adverts that were surveyed in the survey.
That's wild, isn't it?
It is wild. And what's even more wild is that McDonald's adverts were 9 times more likely to be found in the most deprived areas. So look, I mean, like Adfree Cities, Biteback is calling for an end to junk food advertising in public space, as well as online and on TV pre 9 p.m. Now, just bringing us back to meat advertising, this policy would be a good step forward in restricting meat advertising as well as unhealthy food advertising, but a lot of meat advertising doesn't fall under these restrictions on unhealthy food. I mean, some KFC advertising, for example, doesn't. So if we also want to reduce demand for meat and dairy, as well as unhealthy food, because meat and dairy is obviously through intensive farming of animals, driving climate breakdown, nature depletion, and of course animal suffering, we do need to look at restricting advertising for meat and dairy as well.
Okay, and is there any signs of hope on the horizon in that front?
I mean, there hasn't been as much attention on meat and dairy advertising as there has on unhealthy food advertising so far, but we are getting some increased attention on this issue, which is great. There's currently a petition which was started by campaigner Dale Vince, which is calling on the government to stop marketing or stop supporting pro-meat and dairy marketing campaigns and instead invest in public messaging on the benefits of eating more plants. And, this does need government intervention, this issue, right? You're not going to see adverts for carrots and tofu and lentils without it. Now, James, our most recent episode, where you spoke to Simon Mayer, looked at the idea of degrowth. This idea that our economy doesn't need to focus solely on growth at all costs, as it currently does. And when you spoke to Simon about this, you talked about how advertising fits into this whole degrowth picture, didn't you? Yeah,
I did. Yeah, it was a really interesting conversation because it's something that I think for us within Adfree Cities is sort of on our horizon. Like, how does our work fit in with these emerging ideas of degrowth, post-growth, of well-being economies? And we've never really found the space to fit it in properly. So it was a great opportunity to speak to Simon about this. So in the conversation about growth, Simon made this really, I think, important distinction between different kinds of growth. So there's economic growth, GDP, which is kind of what the government always talks about and you read about in the papers. And that's the kind of growth that we really kind of want to limit because it's so associated with ecological destruction, essentially. The higher the GDP goes in your country, essentially, the more damage that you're doing to the planet. As a very kind of broad summary of how that works. But there are other things in life that we do want to grow, right? Like, having more trees and more leisure time. We might want to grow our local economy, even if at a national level we kind of want to see a cap on that. So this opens up interesting questions about the potential role of advertising in promoting these other kinds of growth, right? So advertising today is very intimately linked to economic growth because selling more stuff generates the profits that go towards buying ad space. But could there be some kind of advertising in a degrowth economy, in a post-growth economy? And I think that's a really interesting question that was opened up in that episode with Simon. So in terms of an update on that, I'll admit it's slightly tangential, but kind of related, and also related to some of the things we've been talking about on today's episode. So I found this really cool academic paper in the Journal of Environmental Innovation and Societal Transitions. Familiar with it?
Can't say I am.
It's a riveting read, but I found this academic paper that was really great because it looked at the effectiveness of advertising restrictions on the sale of harmful products. So exactly the kind of stuff that we at Adfree Cities are always calling for, right? These kind of ad bans, ad restrictions, do they actually work? And this study found that basically, yeah, they do. They can encourage innovation of less harmful alternatives to the original harmful thing that was being advertised. So this research paper looked at a specific example of restrictions on advertising for alcohol in Norway, and how those restrictions have led to innovation in alcohol-free beers and other kind of alcoholic drinks that are now non-alcoholic. And the authors of this study conclude that the same principle applies in other product areas too. With, I think, one interesting caveat is that, as the authors in the paper say, where advertising is largely focused on maintaining a positive image for the company rather than the product, banning advertising of the product would be unlikely to influence the product innovation or advertising strategy of the firms. Now, that's a slightly long quote, but just to unpack that, what they're saying there is, if the advertising from a given company is intended kind of to promote the company itself, right, to maintain what we might call social license, then you have to be careful when it comes to putting ad restrictions on those kinds of companies. And this is really relevant in the case of oil and gas companies, because when you see an advert for Shell or BP or Total or Exxon, they're not advertising to sell you petrol. That's not what they're trying to do. They don't need to do that. You're going to buy petrol anyway. They're advertising themselves, their own brand. They're advertising their own legitimacy, their social license to exist. And this is something that, I talked about with Darren Cullen in that episode that we've already talked about. So where does that leave us then in terms of the kind of ad restrictions that we might be calling for? And I think one answer to this is that we need to make sure any ad restrictions that we do see are brand restrictions, not just product restrictions. So it's the companies themselves that cannot advertise if, say, a certain percentage of their product sales come from fossil fuels, right? So then it's companies like Shell, like BP, those big oil companies, that would actually have an incentive then to properly invest in fossil fuel alternatives and not just be able to greenwash themselves because of some token investments in wind farms or electric charging infrastructure or whatever it might be.
That's really interesting. I mean, I think going back to what we were talking about meat and dairy, you could make a similar argument there, couldn't you?
Yeah,
that
exactly.
actually, a company like McDonald's, where really their whole business model is about driving demand for meat and dairy. Imagine if they, with their advertising that often doesn't even feature food, often is about just promoting their brand. I mean, imagine a world where there was an outright ban on McDonald's advertising.
That'd be crazy. Yeah.
Can we imagine such a world?
Yeah, it's so prevalent now that it's almost hard to imagine it.
So that's been a look back on what we've been looking at so far over the last 12 months of our podcast, the first 2 seasons. I guess in conclusion, we're seeing a lot of progress, aren't we? This petition from Chris Packham, which has achieved over 100,000 signatures. We've got this upcoming debate on fossil fuel advertising in Parliament. We're seeing this amazing progress from The Hague and Dutch cities. And I think what's interesting is we're also seeing that progress in the UK is coming primarily from a local level, right? We're seeing great action being taken by councillors, by local residents, by volunteer groups to resist outdoor advertising and to restrict advertising for the most harmful products. We're not seeing so much progress at the national level, and we're certainly not seeing progress from businesses themselves. So, let's work on that. Here's to the next 12 months, eh?
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, tune in for series 3, where hopefully we'll have some better news on those fronts. But yeah, no, you are right. It's been the last 12 months. I mean, well, first of all, it's crazy that we've been doing a podcast for 12 months.
Yay!
Yeah, good for Adfree Cities. A little bit of self-promotion. But yeah, I mean, reflecting back on kind of where we were when we started this podcast, we'd had those kind of policies come in Edinburgh and Sheffield, so that was great. And there was a lot of talk about fossil fuel ad restrictions and the beginnings of action. So to see how that's developed in the last 12 months has been really, really encouraging. And I think has given me actually quite a lot of hope for the direction of travel in the next 12 months and beyond.
Yeah. Now I wonder if we want to just finish with any personal highlights. James, do you have a personal highlight from the podcast over the last 12 months?
It's impossible to choose almost. It's just been solid gold, hit after hit after hit. But if I had to pick one, kind of my favourite episode perhaps, is actually from series 1, the episode with Lizzie Nixon. That kind of tale of a phone box that isn't really a phone box, which was, I think, an insight into just how bizarre our planning system is when it comes to outdoor advertising, the loopholes and kind of the imbalance of power in favour of companies or people who want to put up more advertising against those who want to reduce it or even take away advertising from our public spaces. One thing that I really got out of that episode and the conversation with Lizzie and how she presents it all is how our public spaces, the way that our public spaces look and feel, is a choice, and to a large extent it's a deal, right? It's a deal between what we want and how we pay for it. And maybe we are okay for some things that we want to be paid for via advertising. But currently and importantly, that choice is being made for us by these outdoor advertising companies. And Lizzie's story makes clear, I think, in a really powerful way, the need to democratise the planning process in the UK. So that was my kind of highlight of the last 12 months. Nicola, what about you?
Yeah, that one was great. So for me, I think, like I say, it's hard to choose, but I really enjoyed my chat with Ruth Taylor of the Common Cause Foundation. I think we called that one Selling Love, and it was about advertising and cultural values. And I just really enjoyed Ruth's dissections of the different advertising adverts that we looked at, from Volvo and Apple and Pepsi, from this point of view of cultural values and how advertising uses these kind of appeals to different values to really shape our attitudes, our priorities, and kind of normalising certain behaviours and values, and how, I suppose for me, it really goes to the core of what Adfree Cities is about, and why I think this is really important, to be understanding the influence of advertising, how it works, and how we can challenge it. And I think this really speaks as well to some of the great work that our local ad block groups are doing to showcase positive alternatives. How can we imagine a world where public space is not used for corporate profit? How can we imagine a world where public space is used to promote these values which are truly beneficial to us, the things that we truly need to thrive and to create the society that we want to see? Art, creativity, community, nature. Yeah, so I think for me that was a really kind of core and really interesting and also quite entertaining discussion with Ruth, which gave us a lot to think about.
Wow, what a great way to sign off Series 2. And a reminder to listeners, you can find all our past episodes on Spotify, on Acast, on YouTube, and most other podcast platforms as well. Just search for Better Without Billboards. So thank you for listening, and it's a goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me for now.
For now, yeah. We'll see you again before too long, hopefully, for Series 3.
Thank you.